discussion about the changing Middle East and the implications for women and girls. For those of you that know Meridian, you know that we play a critical role working with our State Department to engage leaders around the world, and have been part of Secretary Clinton's agenda to engage in the cause of helping not only on the tough issues that deal with violence against women and trafficking, but also on the power of women to create economic opportunity and political stability in the world. And obviously the Middle East is a front of mind at the moment. I'd like to just thank the trustees and our fantastic Council on Women's Leadership members. They have really injected a purposeful energy into Meridian and have just come back from a very important mission, cultural mission in the United States, actually, where they engaged with cultural leaders from all over the world. This was in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And so I thank you for your work and for your engagement. Meridian, as you know, you're sitting in buildings that have an incredible history of being a convening place in Washington without an agenda. And that is a very tough thing to find in this town. This is a neutral center where we gather the diplomatic corps, the business community, and the government to try to look for areas of collaboration. And tonight, as well, we're pleased to be joined by two important guests, Eamonn and Kim, who will be introduced by Michele. But I know you'll be in for a treat, and you'll have a chance to give and take, and there'll be a reception afterwards. But I'd like to just say that Michele, in her leadership, has brought a great deal of experience from her work at the State Department, her work in the civil society arena. Her dad, of course, was a titan here in Washington and was one of the people who recruited me into this position. And I was very honored to work with him closely, and I'm honored to work with Michele. So over to you, Michele. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm just going to ask, can everybody hear me? Really quick mic test. So, is that good? Back of the room? Monique?
I think mine's working. You might need to project a little bit more.
Okay. Good evening to all, and thank you for joining us. Is that better? Okay, yeah, it's speaker mode now. Yes. I am Michele Manatt. I am the co-founder and the chair of the Council on Women's Leadership here at Meridian, which was established in June of 2010. I would like to welcome and thank the participation of all of the council members who are here. I see many of them in the front row, including Tammy Collins, who's just back from Santa Fe with me. And I'd like to thank the co-chairs of the council. I don't think any of them are here yet, but Catherine Keller, who's our co-chair for cultural and museum partnerships, is probably going to be joining us. And I know that Robin Diamond and Karen also will be sending their regards, but they're not here this evening, unfortunately. The Council on Women's Leadership at Meridian has two core purposes. One is to provide guidance, inspiration, and direction to the work of Meridian and to its Board of Trustees in its governance of the institution along the lines of the gender and women and girls empowerment and strengthening agenda that has really become the settled business of the diplomatic world and multilateral institutions, many of which are headquartered in Washington, D.C., though not all. Some of them are in New York, many of them are in Europe, and they're gaining importance throughout the world on every single continent. We also provide important resources for Meridian. So we ask for a real commitment from anyone who is considering membership in Meridian's Council on Women's Leadership, but we bring together a network and tap into the rich professional experience and resources of a diverse group of women of all generations, which is something I'm personally very proud of. We have women in their 70s in our council as well as 20-somethings, and I am so far north of being a 20-something that I can easily and humorously use that expression. Since the establishment of the council in June of 2010, one of the most important things that happened in the world is the upheaval in the Middle East and North Africa. And I have been working at all levels within Meridian and outside with stakeholders to try to determine how we can be more effective in helping people better understand and frankly raise their level of worry and concern about the status of women and girls throughout the Middle East and North Africa, which is really in a situation that's intolerable in many of the seeing that more and more the case in countries affected by strife, where you have just a swelling population of refugees and displaced persons because of all that has unfolded since the Arab Spring began in December of 2010 and then really took off in February, March of 2011. So, to that point, and for that reason, when I learned about the book that was written by Kim Ghattas, who's to my right, really detailing and with excruciatingly important and specifically questioning interviews, looking at diplomacy and the shifting power relationships of the United States under the Obama administration and under Hillary Clinton's leadership at the State Department, I thought would be a wonderful and the most appropriate thing to do to invite her to speak to Meridian and be hosted by the Council on Women's Leadership here. So I was utterly delighted that she accepted my invitation. And I thank her very much. I understand she had a busy weekend personally, so being here on a hot Monday evening, I think deserves even more of our praise for that. Let me just direct you, if you haven't seen already, the condensed bios that we've got for everyone. That Kim has been the State Department correspondent of the BBC since 2008. So she's in a very interesting position. She's now covering her third Secretary of State since taking that particular job. She is of Dutch and Lebanese descent, and she, as I say, when we moved to Washington, has been covering us here since 2008. So she brings a perspective that not that many of us probably in the room have. Kim, I followed Kim probably most carefully in her commentaries on the Diane Rehm show on Friday mornings whenever she's on the show, when we have the wisdom and the luck to nail her as a commentator. But she really is just remarkable in how clear she is in explaining very, very complex and nuanced and multifaceted issues around the world, and in particular across the broader Middle East. Her book was published in March of this year, and how many interviews, she'll let us know how many interviews and book tour occasions she's had, but she was at places even like Politics and Prose, so she I think is very generous and speaks to all kinds of audiences, which is very, very kind indeed. And Eamonn Gearon, to my left, is a noted Arabist and author who has a knowledge of parts of the Middle East and North Africa that most people don't have the chance to begin to understand, because he actually lived there for an extended period of time. He was a desert explorer who, on his own, he camel-powered, in other words, on the back of a camel, or perhaps occasionally having the camel follow him, explored the Sahara over years, and has used that knowledge and that exploration, personal and I think geographic and cultural, to serve now as an advisor to a number of governments and militaries, as well as most recently, and I think in the spring coming up, he will be giving another course at Johns Hopkins SAIS, where he is a professorial lecturer on North African politics and security. He only moved here a year ago, and we became introduced through a close friend, Ambassador Louis Gianotti. But I think the most interesting and cool thing about him is that he has figured out the way on a regular basis to secure assignments lecturing on board of cruise ships, including the most prestigious ones anywhere. So I'm sure that he'll have things to say and hopefully share with us from top to toe about what it's like to do that on a cruise ship. So with those two introductions, I would like to invite Kim to essentially take the floor as she wishes. We're going to hear about her comments, her analysis, her thoughts over time and at the moment, and looking forward about what's going on with all of the unsettling change in the Middle East. Then she's going to transition to talk about the book, and then Eamonn's going to make comments on both of those things and more, and then we'll move to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for this introduction. I'm really delighted to be here this evening. Thank you all for coming. Thanks as well to Stuart for his remarks, and to Eamonn for being here. I really love the Meridian Center. I've been here for a few events, and occasionally I thought, I wonder what I could do to get invited here. I know, I'll write a book. So here I am, having written this book, and I'm here to talk to you about women in the Middle East. As Michele mentioned, I am Lebanese myself, so I'm an Arab woman. I grew up in Beirut during the Civil War. My father is Lebanese, my mother is Dutch, and I lived in Lebanon my whole life until I moved to the US 5 years ago. So the perspective that I bring to my writing, to my thinking, to my journalism is very much that of an Arab woman, but also a woman who's had the opportunity to be exposed to Western culture through her mother and through her travels. So without wanting to sound too cliche, that can sort of bridge the gap between those two worlds. And as I look at the region, like many of you, I notice a lot of negative changes. And the question that people ask themselves today is mostly, are women the losers in this revolution that we're seeing? I tend to shy away from the expression Arab Spring because it instantly conjures up images of winter. If anybody with a bit of historical perspective knows that revolutions have a lot of ups and downs. So it's part of the course that there should also be moments of pessimism and moments of upheaval when you're in the middle of the revolution. So I shy away from the word spring and I stick to the word revolution. And the question that everybody is asking themselves is, are women the losers? Is their fate going to get worse? Is it getting worse because of the rise of Islamist governments in the region? You look at news coming out of Egypt, and there are headlines about rapes on Tahrir Square or virginity tests ordered by the army. You look at the Egyptian parliament, and only 8 women out of 498 seats. That's just about 2%. You look at Morocco, only 1 woman minister. You look at Syria, where the conflict has been going on for over 2 years, and there are reports of rape as a weapon. You look at Libya, and you are wondering whether women are going to be left behind there as well, because they're debating whether to have quotas to include women in elections. In Tunisia, attempts to rewrite the law there as well, which would reverse gains made by women under the rule of the previous leader, Zine al Abidine Ben Ali. Women in Tunisia seem to have a lot of importance in politics, in society. They were at the forefront of women's rights, and there's a sense that things are being reversed there for them as well. So overall, it looks like a grim picture, and it leads to those questions. Is this all bad for women? And it leads to very alarming headlines. But as I know myself, being a journalist, these are the headlines. And I would like to point out a few of the more positive examples that the revolution has brought us as well. For example, Tawakkul Karman, a Yemeni journalist and politician with Al-Islah Party. She was the co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011 because of her role in advocating for change. She played a key role in pushing forward with the demonstrations. She was described as the Iron Woman, the mother of the revolution. You look at Egypt, and one of the people credited with really bringing people out onto the street on January 25th of 2009, when the revolution really took off, was a very young 26-year-old woman called Asma Mahfouz, who recorded a YouTube video and put it online, calling on people to go out and say, if you don't, you're a traitor. You're a traitor to this country. You have to go out. People can't just say, well, it's not just up to me. It is up to every single one of us. And she remains active today. You look at Eamonn Gearon and Manal Sharif in Saudi Arabia. Eamonn is a blogger, and Manal Sharif took her car for a ride in Saudi Arabia to try to demonstrate that women wanted change as well. Women in Saudi Arabia can't drive, but Manatt went out there and she tried to demonstrate that women in Saudi Arabia also want change. You look at Syria, Samad Yazbek, an Alawite journalist and writer in exile since 2011, has written a heart-wrenching book about her experience as a dissident, someone from the Alawite community, which is the community of President Bashar al-Assad, and how she has been branded as a traitor. You look at Haifa al-Mansour, the first female Saudi movie director. You look at Lubna Olayan, the CEO of Olayan Financing Company, one of the top 100 Forbes, or she is one of the top 100, she's part of the list of the top 100 most important women by Forbes. And the family's net worth is about $12 billion. And her father, if I understand the story correctly from her, she has two brothers, but when he wanted to retire and give the company to his children, he decided that she should be in charge, not the brothers. The brothers are part of the chair, but she is the CEO. So what does that tell us, really, about the Middle East? It tells us one thing, that women in the region are not one monolithic, downtrodden mass. There are a lot of very powerful women there. They have been there for a long time. They have been pushing for more rights, for recognition for a while. And they don't often make it into the headlines because it's a slow process of chipping away at the current situation. And because there is a tendency to focus on bad news. I think I know that as well myself as a journalist, unless we're all here to discuss the birth of a royal baby in the UK. But the other thing that tells us is that there is perhaps another question to be asked about the Arab uprisings and the Arab revolutions. Instead of asking whether women are the losers of this movement, I think the question is this an opportunity for women to really push and advance for more recognition and for more rights? Because this is a moment of change in the region. It's a decisive moment for the Arab world as a whole, but it is also a key moment for women. This revolution, these revolutions, because they are taking place across the Arab world, and in each country they bring their own problems and their own specificity. But the revolution was not gender-based, and yet it is a turning point for women as well, because this is a moment when, just as the rest of the region is coming of age, there is an opportunity for women and people who want change in general to take their place, claim their rights. Women are calling for more respect, for more dignity, for rule of law, just as everybody else is in the region. And it does provide an opportunity for them to make their voice heard and bring change about. It is a moment of intense change in the region. Laws are being rewritten, and women are pushing to have a say. And they will fight for what they want, as we've seen. Tawakkul Karman in Yemen, or Asma Mahfouz in Egypt, or Samad Yazbek. It's not going to be easy. But just the way that around the region people are saying there's no going back, if we don't like the new government will bring it down the way they've done in Egypt for the second time. Women are also saying, you know, we're not going to settle anymore. This is an opportunity for us as well. That doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean that there aren't going to be setbacks. It doesn't mean that Islamist governments are going to try to impose laws that are to the detriment of women. But it's important to remember that women have faced obstacles in the region for a long time. This isn't new. I mean, the stories about women not being able to thrive in Saudi Arabia or abuses across the region, this isn't new. So what you're seeing today, the headlines that you're seeing today, are really an expression of a history that has been there for some time, of obstacles that women have faced, but perhaps have not been able to talk about in as many details as they are being able to today. This is a battle that women have been fighting in the past, but that is accelerating today as they also see an opportunity to make changes in the right direction. Now, obstacles will remain, as I said, and they span from traditions, because this is a traditional region. Religion is part of people's culture. It is a conservative region, and I'll get to this specific point in a moment because it has implications for women amongst themselves as well. There is violence, just as in Syria. Religious law, which men in many countries will continue to impose, but women as well, and I'll get to that in a second. But women will not be silenced anymore. And I think that it is important to recognize that and to work with women in the region, but not necessarily to be alarmed by the headlines. I think that if women are screaming scandal, if women are out there demanding their rights, it's a sign that they have also recognized that this is an opportunity for them. But looking at it from the outside, from the United States or from the West, I think it's also important to recognize the nuances of how this movement is going to go forward. Just like it's not possible to expect that Egypt or Lebanon or Syria will look like a Western democracy within 5 or 10 or 15 years, it's not also possible to expect that women's rights in the region will necessarily or perhaps even instantly look like what women in, or like what women's rights look like in the West. Because the regions are different, traditions are different, customs are different. And that, I'm not saying that women should therefore settle for less, but there is a different process going forward. Women amongst themselves don't always agree in the region about what is best for them or what it is that they want. And I think it's important, looking from the outside, not to focus on appearances. I'll give you an example. Saudi Arabia and driving and the veil. These are the two most apparent ways in which women in Saudi Arabia appear to be downtrodden. But it's not necessarily the key focus of women in Saudi Arabia. It's not necessarily what they are most concerned about. I've heard many women tell me, I don't need a driver. I don't want to drive. I have a driver. Walking around the region, walking around the country, you see women wearing the full black cloak with the veil. And at first, Western women may think, isn't it awful? Isn't it awful to be dressed like that all the time? It's hot, you're constrained. And in many cases it is, but if you're used to it, I've had a lot of Saudi women tell me, all these Western women, don't they feel naked with that? So it's a question of perception, and I think it's important to recognize that we all bring our diversity to the table, we all bring our culture, and that women in the Middle East will fight for their rights, perhaps in a slightly different way than was done in the West, or perhaps with a different focus on what matters most to them. For a lot of women in Saudi Arabia, the priority is not necessarily to be able to drive. It would make sometimes life easier, but it's not their priority. They want to be able to work. They want to be able to open businesses without requesting permission from their legal guardian. And so it's not necessarily helpful to focus only on appearances or what is so anathema to women in the West. Women here think, if you can't drive, how can you achieve anything? There are other priorities for women in the Middle East. And then I also think that it's important not to focus too much on appearances, because women of all backgrounds are fighting for more rights, for more recognition. Tawakkul Karman herself, the Yemeni co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, wore a full niqab until 2004. That's the full cloak where you only see the eyes. And if you subscribe to, cliches, you'd think that she, was uneducated, had no opinions of her own, had no say about anything, but she did, despite the cloak. She eventually took it off and now only wears a veil. But I think it's important not to assume that women who are veiled are at the mercy of their fathers or their husbands. They have a lot of power themselves. Same for Asma Mahfouz, who is also veiled. So I guess that what I'm trying to say with those points is that we all bring something different to the table, and I think it's important not to generalize and not to get hung up on appearances, whether it's the veil or whether it's the ability to drive or not to drive. And then another point about what women are going through in the Middle East is that I think that as they go through, as we go through, because I am from the Middle East as well, as we go through these changes, there is also a need for consensus between secular women and women who are conservative and observant and religious, because they are all from the same region, but they don't necessarily see eye to eye about what is best for them as women. You have a lot of very conservative women who would also advocate for more male dominance. That's a very long debate about why it happens and whether they are simply not able to see beyond what they've been taught by their fathers or their husbands. But in 2009, for example, in Saudi Arabia, there was a campaign launched by a woman in collaboration with members of the royal family to strengthen the guardianship system, and it was called "My Guardian Knows What's Best for Me." That's not something that I can relate to as a Lebanese woman, but it is a debate that is going to take place between women in the Arab world amongst themselves, and I think it's important to allow them that space to decide what it is that they want, just as people in the region are now trying to decide what it is that they want for themselves, for their future, having moved beyond the colonial era, moved beyond perhaps even expecting the US to do everything for them, or expecting that all the answers come from the US. And I discussed that in the book, and I'm sure we'll talk about it now. They want to do it for themselves, and it's going to be difficult, it's going to be painful, and there's going to be a lot of violence. But the region is coming of age. There will be many ups and downs, but I do think that there is hope. It is very important to hold on to hope when you live in the Middle East. And I know that firsthand, because I lived through 15 years of civil war, and I think holding on to the hope that things will get better is the only way to keep your sanity when you've gone through what I've gone through. My own experience as a woman in the Arab world is one that I would like to share with you, because when I wrote the book, one of the questions I got a lot was, what is it like as a woman to do this job? What was it like as a woman to report on the Arab world? What was it like as a woman to interact with Hillary Clinton? Did it give you did it enable you to have a special rapport with her? And I was a little bit confused by the question at first, especially coming from Americans or Europeans, because I knew I was a woman, but I never really thought of my job or my career from a gender perspective. And I started wondering why. And I was particularly struck when a British friend of mine said, this is such an achievement that you've written this book, especially as a woman. And I said, well, why are you saying that? And she said, well, it's tough being a woman. We're still fighting for recognition, we're fighting for equal pay, and I understood that at an intellectual level, but then she said something which really surprised me. She said, growing up as a British teenager in England, my father, wasn't really sure that he should send me and my sister to high school. And I thought, what? This is a young British woman of my age who's telling me that her father wasn't sure that it was worth sending his daughters to high school and university. And that's when it finally hit me. I thought, Lebanese man of reasonably modest backgrounds. He's a self-made man, but he grew up in the Bekaa Valley. And he married a Dutch woman, which was quite, reflected quite a lot of openness on his part. He had 3 daughters, and he never once said to me or my sisters, "You can't do this because you're a girl." It was never part of the conversation. It was never something that I heard growing up, and it was never something that I heard from any of my female friends either. Now, I know that I come from a certain social background where education for girls is accepted. It may not be so much in the Bekaa Valley where my father grew up, but I did have the opportunity the luck to have a father who never once said to me, "You can't do this because you're a girl," which meant that wherever I went, whatever I did, I just thought, I can do that. And if I can't do it, neither can a man. I would go to Saudi Arabia and interview people there. I traveled to Iraq on my own before the war, and after the war, I traveled to Syria. I called my father recently to tell him, I only now understand or appreciate the gift that you've given me, that I move about in this world without ever thinking that there is something that I can't do because I'm a woman. I do think that being a woman allowed me certain access in the Middle East because it meant that I could go to countries like Saudi Arabia and speak to women, whereas a man working on his own perhaps could not have had that access, and it enriches my reporting as well. But I do thank my father for giving me that openness and that confidence in my own abilities. Now, I know that I and my father are maybe not the rule in the Arab world, but I also know that we are not the exception. So I call on you all to have faith in the women of the Arab world and of the Middle East, because we are strong, we do have power, and we just need a little bit more time to impose ourselves a bit more. Thank you for listening.
That's most welcome to hear that we need to think of things and take a much deeper and different look than perhaps the way we are able to based on the Western reporting and other simple analysis that we would probably have the chance and the time to dive into every day. Can we transition to giving the opportunity to talk about the book a bit, and then we'll pitch it over to Eamonn. Give us an idea, how did you come, at what point did you decide to write the book? Was it as much in response to seeing what other colleagues were doing, since we know that those in your profession work harder and longer than ever before because of all the platforms that you're expected to populate? But a little bit about how the book came about, and you interviewed Hillary Clinton 19 times. 19 times for all the research and preparation of such a book. You also got to spend a little time with those of a different generation, like Brent Scowcroft, because you were using it as a way of trying to better understand and put in context what you had lived through as a teenager and a young person. And what surprised you in the writing of the book that you found out, be it about the system and the policy apparatus of the United States, or what you say, people in effect, there's less distance now between what is said and intended and what actually happens in U.S. positions and things. So as a start, why don't you take those?
Sure. So I came to the U.S. in 2008, and I started covering Condoleezza Rice as a Secretary of State, and then Hillary Clinton came into office a year later. And I think that the moment that I really started thinking about writing a book was when I took a trip with her to Beirut, my hometown, in April of 2009. I had been reporting on American foreign policy for just over a year, and I was learning a lot about the workings of American foreign policy making. I was really at the heart of the foreign policy machine in the US, or as close as you can be as a journalist. But traveling to Beirut, I realized that not only did I have a front row seat to that foreign policy in the making, but I really came face to face again with my own background. I was in Beirut. I remembered what it was like growing up there, the questions that I had about American foreign policy, about American power. And traveling around the world with Clinton and Condoleezza Rice, I found many echoes of those same questions around the world. Why doesn't the US help us? Why is the US doing this? Why doesn't the US do more of that? And going to Beirut with Clinton, those two lives, if you will, intersected. My life as a Lebanese who had grown up on the receiving end of American decisions, and my life as a reporter with a front row seat to American foreign policy in the making came together at that moment in Beirut. And that's where the idea of the book slowly started coming to me. It took me a long time to, take the decision fully to write the book and start the process, which is quite lengthy. But that's kind of how the book came to me. And I also wanted to write something that was accessible to a wide audience. I wanted, in essence, to write the book for myself, my younger self. The 14-year-old in Beirut who didn't understand, or the 12-year-old in Beirut who didn't understand why she had to live through a war, and who at 13 didn't quite understand how it had ended, and why peace didn't really feel like peace. I wanted to write it for the people I met in Pakistan who had all these wild theories about what the US was up to. Theories I could now address because, having been in the US for a couple of years, I could tell them, well, actually, you may think that the US is in bed with the Taliban because you think they're trying to undermine you and trying to favor India, but that's not quite how it works. That's not what's going on. All these conspiracy theories that people have about US power in the world. And I felt that the best way to write a book that was accessible to a wide audience, well beyond a small group of foreign policy experts, was to write it like a story. It's a chronological narrative. It is a journey across thousands of miles around the world on planes and racing motorcades into kings' palaces and presidential offices, and I really take the reader along with me for that journey, so that people everywhere can understand how American foreign policy is made, even people in the US. For people in the US also to understand how the rest of the world perceives American power, and what better central character to put at the center of the book than Hillary Clinton, who is a very compelling character, very popular politician, even though when she started as Secretary of State, she was still a polarizing politician, but she has moved on, I think, somewhat. So that's how the book came together. That's why I decided to write it. And I really got to know Clinton to some extent over the course of those 4 years and those 19 interviews. 18 of them were for the BBC. They were reporting interviews for television and radio, and one of them was a lengthy sit-down for the book. But you really get to know someone when you travel with them, as they say. So I saw, Hillary Clinton under all sorts of circumstances, in top form, very tired, jet-lagged, slightly annoyed by the heat, talking to leaders, talking to young students, to women, and you are able to put together a much more nuanced impression, a much more nuanced reading of a person when you follow them over the course of several years. And that's also what I try to do throughout the book, is to bring nuance to the discussion about American power, about American foreign policy, and to bring to American readers nuance about how the rest of the world sees them. But I think that, I'm not sure if there's one thing that I learned that is the most surprising. I was certainly very taken by the process of writing the book, and you know what it's like to write a book. It's a very intensive process, but for me it was also very cathartic, because I had never written about growing up in the war before. It wasn't something that I had, up until then, been able to really address head on. We talked about it a little bit with my family, with my friends. I'd written one small piece for the BBC about leaving Lebanon in 2008 and looking back at the country that I was leaving behind, and my nieces in Beirut. So I think that because the book is all about the nuances, it's difficult to give you one headline about what was the most surprising, but it's really a better, deeper understanding of the hard work that is diplomacy. And perhaps, if I do have to sum it up into one sentence, it's not easy to be the superpower.
Just to give you an idea of the reach of the book, it was published in Dutch, at the same time it was published in English, and next year it will be published in Chinese and Korean. And down the road, but hopefully not too far down the road, if you're expecting it will be published in Arabic.
Well, I'm hoping.
Yeah,
But I think the Arab world is kind of busy with a lot of other things.
So it makes great gifts for anyone you might know anywhere. So maybe you want to
And
walk
they'll
out
come
in
out in paperback next year as
The
well.
paperback will come out in spring,
In the spring.
summer of next year, and that will include a bit of an update
But afterward.
afterward. Why don't we transition and ask Eamonn to take the reins here and kick some other thoughts around and help us understand where perhaps we are falling short in our analysis, or the way that we often come to puzzle over and, as I said, begin worry about the situation in the broader Middle East.
Thank you. Very nice to be here. It's my first visit to the Meridian Center, and I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I've got two sets of comments that I'd like to make, and the first comments are related to Kim's book. Kim mentioned the word twice, I think, in the past 20 minutes, and it was the first word I wrote down on this piece of paper as I was sitting here listening to Kim, and the word is nuance. Nuance. I sometimes describe myself as a recovering journalist. I spent many years working for print journalism in the Middle East as a freelance and as a stringer. And I covered some pretty gruesome stories and tried to pitch some less nasty, more culturally aware pieces, which didn't always get into the papers because, as we appreciate, dog bites man isn't news. Man bites dog, that's news. So I was delighted when I came to this book, and before I say one more word about the book, I must confess that I've got some markers here. Don't worry, I'm not going to read it all, because I haven't finished reading the book. Now, why do I say that? It sounds like a negative, surely. Well, it's not. When the book arrived in the post from the publisher, my wife collected the post, and she opened it on page 1, and she didn't give it to me until she got to the very last page. So compelling did she find the read. But thankfully, Laura, who is here with us this evening, being such a good reader, gave me a whole list of references for things that she knew I would find particularly interesting. So I'll give you the short form in a while.
Did she tell you how it ends?
It's not the butler. It's the Secretary of State. The book is nuanced, as I said, and I think, and it's very thoughtful. It is written for an intelligent reader who perhaps isn't an expert. I don't need to plug the book anymore. It will sell itself. I would like to move on now to think about the Middle East today. I've been living in the greater Middle East for close to 20 years, everywhere from Afghanistan to Morocco. And I have been in Washington, D.C., as Michele said, for just under a year. I arrived last October. And it's fascinating being here to listen to people and to get the views primarily of Americans, but also foreign diplomats and foreign workers inside the Beltway, as to how they view the Middle East. And you know, in most cases, we're talking about a completely different part of the world. Everything I saw, everything I experienced, 9/10 of which was kindness, generosity, and equitable treatment for myself and my friends. It seems that that message is missing completely from the view we have in Washington, D.C. of a foreign place. It's just over there. We constantly talk about them. And of course, that's a natural use of the word in English, that it's a them and us. But I always feel that it rather sets us up for conflict, that somehow people in the Middle East are the other, as though somehow they're different, as though people in the Middle East don't want to live in a secure environment and have a job and to provide for their families like the we do. They're people. And I, again, appreciate the fact that we have shorthand in our language. So we talk about Arabs in the same way that we perhaps talk about Africans, as though Africans are a unitary whole, or that Arabs are a unitary whole. Don't forget, we're talking about people. People, male and female. My grandmother, who was full of words of wisdom, I remember very clearly when I was 4 or 5 years of age, I was perhaps a very garrulous young boy, and she told me, she said, Eamonn, you know, God gave you 1 mouth and 2 ears, so that you might listen twice as much as you speak. It was a lesson I took with me to the Middle East, and as far as possible, I like to listen to people because I want to understand more. I'm not a preacher, I'm somebody who's trying to learn. I'm trying to learn about other people, whether they be in the Middle East, of a different skin colour, of a different religion, of a different gender to myself, or whether I'm in London, visiting people that I think I should know. And indeed, as somebody who isn't from America, I don't know if you picked up on the fact that I'm not from around these parts, but there are assumptions made here of British people and Americans that we understand each other because we have this similar language, that we're both from similar backgrounds. Well, let me tell you, every week I have cultural misunderstandings in this country. Why? Because we make assumptions. And if you looked at me walking down the street, you'd say, look at that, there's a white chap, young, middle-aged, walking down the road. We must understand him because he's like us. There is no us in Washington, D.C. any more than there is in the Middle East. And I'm sorry if it's a difficult road we have to take, but the road towards wisdom and understanding is a long road. It may be rocky, it may be a narrow path. So what? The results are far greater for having made that journey with partners from the region. I think the idea of partnership comes across very well in the book, that we should, as far as possible, avoid hubris. Avoid the idea that we know best because we are in the superpower and they are not. For sure, there are things that we can take to the world and show, help people to learn X, Y, or Z. But equally, the Middle East has the ABC that we can learn from. And I think the point of a partnership, and this is as true in marriage as it is with international relations, a partnership means, at its very root, equitable relations. If we go in and tell people what they're doing wrong, tell them how they can fix it because we know and you don't, you're in a hiding to nothing. Relationships are built on trust, as much here as there. You know, it would be going too far to say we are all the same, but at our heart we are. I mentioned earlier we want the same things. Now, forgive me if I'm preaching to the converted here, but it's a message which so often I'm confronted with people who would like to argue against it. People who, for instance, who've never travelled to the Middle East will tell me I'm wrong when I say that Arabs are an hospitable people. People who say, well, it's very dangerous. And I say, well, I've rarely felt threatened. I feel a great deal more threatened walking around at midnight in London than I do in Cairo. They say, you're wrong. And I say, I think I know when I feel threatened. And you jabbing your finger at me is quite threatening. So, you know, stop it and listen. History. I was in Meydan Tahrir for those fateful 18 days of what I now like to think of as phase 1 of the revolution. A revolution, of course, by definition, is something which turns. It might not always go back to the same place, but a revolution turns. I remember on about day 7, I stepped out of Meydan Tahrir into the general downtown area of Cairo and saw it in a light that I had never seen it before. There were barricades. It was a bit like a war zone, but without the bullets flying, at least, as I say, by this day 7. And a man approached me, who was obviously from the secret police, the Mukhabarat, feared in Egypt because they could make people disappear. And when you're grabbed by a security officer in Cairo, you don't argue the toss. You don't say, who do you think you are? You go quietly with them. Well, on this day, when the chap said, what are you doing? And I said, taking photographs, you'd think it would be obvious as I had a camera to my face, but there we are. He said, you can't take photographs here. And I said, oh, why not? He said, come with me. And as he grabbed my arm, I shouted at him. I would never have done that a year before. And I'm not an Egyptian. I know that as a foreigner with a foreign passport in Cairo, what harm will come to me is close to non-existent. But I shouted at this man because he'd annoyed me. And when I raised my voice to him, something remarkable happened that I hadn't seen in the previous decades of travelling in Cairo and other states where the secret police used to have free rein. And that was a small group of men and women came out from behind the barricades and chased him away. It was at that moment I knew Mubarak was finished. Because just as I was in Berlin in 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell, what happened that day in Cairo, as I saw it before me, was a wall of fear collapsing. And when the fear disappeared, so too did that secret policeman, as if by magic. The famous British Prime Minister of the 19th century, Lord Salisbury, was asked once about turning points and moments in history, and he was asked if he thought that things in Britain in the 19th century shouldn't change. And he responded by saying, change? Why would you want things to change? They're quite bad enough already. Obviously, we don't know what's going to come out of the revolutions in the Middle East. It might look a great deal worse in the short term. In the long term, it must be wholly positive. Not the results, but the activity, the striving towards a greater future, which is being led by ordinary men and women. Now, when I use the phrase ordinary men and women, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean high officials, as much as the unemployed, and the teachers, the men, the women, the students, the doctors. They are all ordinary people. At their heart, they are people. I'm coming back again to this point, that everybody is a stakeholder in their own country. Everybody has a role to play. And in the past 2.5 years, sometimes more smoothly than we would expect, and sometimes a great deal more bloodily than we would like, we are seeing people across societies in North Africa and the greater Middle East coming together to effect change. A very important point that you made, Kim, was that it doesn't mean that they're all wanting the same sort of change. We might think about women's rights. I was born in 1970. In that year, in England, my mother couldn't rent a television set without a signature from a male member of the family. In that year, 1970, women got the vote for the first time in parts of Switzerland. we mustn't imagine that change never takes place. I think too often, again, we look at the Middle East as a place that doesn't change. Oh, it's always like that. People are saying it's always like that when they see violence in Syria. And they say, well, what about 3 years ago when there wasn't violence in Syria? Well, it's all the same. They say, oh, it's always like that in the Middle East. And I say, what, when there are revolutions? Well, of course not. The revolutions are another moment in time. The Middle East is not set in aspic or in stone. It's constantly changing. It's a dynamic region, just as much as the West, whatever that term means. But the fact is, if we do not get our facts straight, and if we do not understand the region with nuance, we will never see the fact that change is the only constant there is in the Middle East. Things are constantly changing there. And we must be more attuned to the differences in societies. And I mean by that each country in the Middle East as a unique entity. In just the same way that when I think of going home, which I am to England tomorrow, I don't think of myself as being particularly Greek, although we're both Europeans. There are differences in societies, and they must be appreciated. In terms of foreign policy in the Middle East, I think this is something which you make very clearly in the book, Kim, and it's something which I've been confronted with on hundreds of occasions, literally hundreds. People in the Middle East who are looking at America, typically at America, sometimes to Europe, will say, they'll say one of two things. They'll say, America is all-powerful. If Iraq is in chaos, it's because America wants it to be in chaos. Or they will say, America is powerless to do anything. So it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. Either America is omnipotent, or it's impotent. And I try and encourage people in the Middle East who have one of these two extreme views to recognize again the nuance, and the nuance of American society. That America is neither impotent nor omnipotent. I think that comes across very beautifully in the book. And I think I'd just like to finish with a couple of thoughts on women and girls in the region, and are they losing out? It's an interesting idea, one that I was thinking back to examples from history. Again, women in the Middle East are often not seen in the same circumstances as they may be in the West. It doesn't mean that they have no role, or that they have never been active in politics, or entertainment, or in activism. Sometimes they are just not the public face. But trust me, if you come up against any number of Cairene women, they rule their families with a rod of iron. You can have an influence that isn't necessarily the public face, and I'm not advocating that they shouldn't be more public, that's not what I'm saying. But don't assume, just because you don't see somebody, that they're not there. And I think I'll finish on that note. Thank you.
I think that what has sort of been distilled over these several years since these revolutions were launched is a sense of the marginalization of women in the process. And that really, I think, primarily is because of the way that things are reported, and so much of what we in, say, this room and bigger, broader Washington, D.C. are able to read and digest is what's available in English, or perhaps English, Spanish, and French. But it's very rare, frankly, that you come across Arabic speakers, so we're losing a tremendous amount about it. I also think that there aren't very many public and publicly recognized Arab women. I mean, I can't name 5, frankly. Hanan Ashrawi is probably the one who has had incredible staying power, but who is also among the best known and has been the face of that movement. So I think that's one of the real limitations. There just isn't a communicator for that segment of the population. I think it might be a good time to just move to questions from the audience, because we have a very full room and we have a lot of great food for thought and fodder here. So I don't always believe in taking the prerogative as the chair. Why don't we go with a mobile mic that Heather Haynes has, if you could just identify yourself, and if you choose to, your affiliation, and try to keep your question or question and comment brief.
I can speak up if I need to. Okay. My name is Allison Shapira. I teach public speaking and presentation skills. And so my question for Kim, as you talk about the Arab Revolution as an opportunity for women who want to do this themselves, who want to assert themselves, what role is there for people like myself who work with women around the world to find their voice? What role is there for women from outside the region to help in a way that doesn't bring with it unintended consequences?
I think that's a great question, and I love that you have thought about it. I think that there is always an opportunity for people like you to bring your skills and your expertise to people and to women everywhere, whether it's the US or Latin America or the Arab world. I think that women in the Arab world, as you just pointed out, don't always speak in public, but they can certainly make their voices heard in private. So, you know, they are quite powerful. They can be very, they have a very acerbic tone sometimes. They rule at home. But as you were pointing out, it's not because you can't see them that they're not out there. I think women in Saudi Arabia own half of the capital that are in banks, so that's a lot of money. But when it comes to public speaking, and that goes to the point that you were making, they're not always out there making the case for themselves, for their fellow Arab sisters. And I think that if you wanted to take your skills and your expertise to the Arab world, I think it's important to always be attuned to the culture. I think that, you know, is fairly obvious, and to understand that change comes sometimes in a revolution, but sometimes it still comes one step at a time. And I think it's always important to remember how those cultural boundaries or those cultural, the cultural history, the traditions impact the way women operate in their environment, because you can push too hard and then there's a backlash. But I think it would be great. I don't think public speaking is something that is necessarily recognized as a skill in the Arab world, and I think a lot of male leaders could use, you know, a bit of, you know, coaching when it comes to public speaking, because there is something about the Arab language that is quite flowery and quite lengthy, and there's a lot of rhetoric, and there's a lot of, you know, droning on and on. So I think you should go to the Middle East and be, you know, don't discriminate when it comes to who you're going to offer your coaching to. But I think it's a great idea. There?
I guess I can speak up. My name is Hugh Grindstaff. But this is the changing Middle East and what it means for women. But if you look at the European woman who was arrested, who was raped and then arrested for publicizing that, that's not a changing ideal. And then you have, sort of stretching it Middle East, but the Muslim world, Malala, how she has came out and really became a force, and even had the Taliban sort of retreating a little bit, saying, oh, we didn't mean that, we meant to do this to her. So that you've got two different perspectives there on women more or less in the Muslim world, but not put as part of the Middle East.
Well, I think the incident in the UAE isn't a change. It's part of an endemic problem in the Middle East that's been there forever. I mean, and that's just going back to what we've been saying. The headlines that are coming out of the Middle East are not necessarily about the situation deteriorating only. It's a focus on women's issues in the way that we haven't seen in the past. Some of these problems have been there for a long time. I think it would be foolish to assume that, or for anyone to think that before the uprisings, women had all their rights and they had no problems, and now that there is a revolution, they're on the losing end. Quite the opposite. There have been many problems before, they've been written about before, I know them, my friends know them, I've reported on them in the Middle East, but what you're seeing now is people being more vocal about it. You are seeing the reporting about, virginity tests in Egypt in the way you hadn't before, even if perhaps the problem was there before. So that's, in a way, something positive, that these things are being talked about in the open, they're being reported about. And it also means that women see that there is an opportunity to bring about change for themselves. And the incident in the UAE, I don't think it's connected in any sort of way to the Arab uprisings. It's just weird laws, is all I can say. Question here?
It's Dee Cutler. I've spent quite a bit of time in the Middle East, particularly in Tunisia and Saudi Arabia. And when you were talking that people are saying there's no change in the Middle East, look at the Gulf. All the countries, Saudi Arabia, in 1932 they were living in tents. Now they've got computers, cars. It's quite extraordinary, that part. And then I think for women, and this you must know, is Arab women do not like to be judged through Western eyes. They think, in many ways, that they're freer than we are. They've got the whole family system, which is like a social security base, and hair and veiling is not important at all. They want to be able, as you said, to be free to work, be free to travel, and not have to depend on their men. But basically, it was a wonderful and interesting discussion that both of you had.
Just to make a quick point about change, actually, because I'm going to disagree with you about something. It's always good to. I wonder whether what people are complaining about isn't so much that the region isn't changing, but that people from the outside are looking at the region and thinking, why isn't it the way it used to be? This is all going terribly wrong. And they're nostalgic for, 2010, when, Mubarak was there and King Abdullah was there, and well, he is still there. But things were just, easier to understand. Don't you think that that's what people are struggling with? I mean, my answer to that is always that nostalgia for a dictator is not a policy, and there's no going back. But is it that people don't see the region, wonder why the region isn't changing, or that they're actually wondering why it's changed so much and it's all going in the wrong direction?
It's a good point, a valid point. I just think that even when parts of the Middle East, any part of the Middle East, any country, as outsiders, we look to those years of Mubarak or the years of Ben Ali, and we think that because there's one person who is the president or the prime minister, and we have this stability of a single leader, that things aren't changing. But of course, they're always changing under the surface, and that's, I suppose, what I was alluding to. When we, for instance, think about the Muslim Brotherhood, we just use those two words, Muslim Brotherhood, and people immediately, inevitably, we have a picture in our heads, and we think, oh, okay, I understand, Muslim Brotherhood. Well, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt is not like the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt isn't like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. There's no unitary whole. I could give you the names of 5 different Muslim Brotherhood leaders in Egypt, and I say leaders because there are different factions, there are different views within the Muslim Brotherhood. If you look at the Republican Party or the Democratic Party in America, not everybody in that party has the same view as all of their party members. It's very much the case in Egypt that the Muslim Brotherhood is not a unified entity, nor is it unchanging. You know, from its foundation in 1928 as a religious social movement, it has become a political party via a period of being a terrorist group. I mean, these are significant changes in an 80-year period. And yet when we say Muslim Brotherhood, people say, oh, 1928, 2013, Muslim Brotherhood. Yeah, the title might be the same. But for instance, the Labour Party in England of 2013 is not the Labour Party of the early 20th century in England. They're different parties. Things change, but when we rely just perhaps on the label or the title and we don't get the nuance, the backstory, the understanding of the history, it looks the same because it's complicated. And if we don't have the time to spend learning this stuff, we're going to fall back on the, oh, well, it's all the same. It's not an argument, you know. An opinion doesn't pass for analysis. They're not the same.
Let me just say that one thing Kim mentioned very early on about women across the Middle East not necessarily having the same agenda or the same sense of what the objectives are or what their bottom line is. We certainly haven't achieved that in the United States either. Any other questions? Have we missed anybody? Karen Maples, who I did not introduce earlier, but now I get the pleasure of our vice chair.
Karen Maples, I'm on the council leadership team. I want to make a comment and have both of you comment on this. As a quote-unquote naive American, what I've seen in the Middle East since the Arab Spring, as well as with the Iraq War, is when you have someone who's been a dictator like Saddam Hussein, Mubarak in Egypt, once they're gone, there's a power vacuum. And you have all of these different people who've been cooperating and living together, perhaps primarily from fear, but now all of a sudden they each have the opportunity to vie for their place in the country. And I think the uncertainty of where that will lead is one of the things that's disconcerting for Americans. And I think the other issue with that is there's a difference in being an organization that's protested or perhaps been classified as a terrorist organization and what it takes to actually govern a country when you come in. I think that's one of the things that's been a challenge for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So I'd be very interested in each of your perspectives on what is the trajectory that you see in terms of these power vacuums being addressed and alleviated.
It's very difficult to generalize because every country is different, which is exactly the point that Eamonn is trying to make. You know, Syria is not Libya, Libya is not Egypt, Egypt is not Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia is not Jordan. So I try not to generalize. I do understand that it's very disconcerting for people watching the Arab world from afar because there is a lot of upheaval, there is a lot of violence, whether it's in Syria or even in Libya where the situation hasn't stabilized. You're watching the demonstrations in Egypt, second time that the leader is deposed, you know, in Egypt, phase 2 of the revolution. But 2 points. Like I just said, you know, nostalgia for a dictator is not a policy. The stability that was there gave people a false sense of security. And watching from outside, it looked as though everything was kind of okay. But there is a reason why these revolutions erupted. They didn't just happen overnight. People were starting to slowly protest and push back against the repression since 2004, 2007 across the Arab world because they just had enough. I mean, Tawakkul Karman in Yemen had been active since 2004. I spoke to people, young activists in Syria who before anyone had even noticed the depth of discontent in the country or realized that people were being vocal about it, were already busy pushing against the state in 2007. So this was all boiling under the surface, and then it erupted in end of 2010, beginning of 2011. The other thing is that change and you know, walking that road from dictatorship to you know, democracy, or wherever these countries want to end up, it doesn't happen overnight. You know, other countries in Europe, or you know, the US as well, you know, you've gone through your journey until you've reached the stage where you are today. It was a long time ago, so people forget. But the region is only now getting to that stage where it is ready to go through the upheaval that is necessary to come of age, which is how I describe what's going on in the region. And a lot of the problems that you're seeing today in the Arab world, the sectarian fighting, the spread of militants, the rise in militant, violent Islamist attitudes, I find that, having lived in the region, having reported on it, is a direct result of dictatorship. Because the way these people rule, whether it's Mubarak or Gaddafi or Assad, is by sowing the seeds of division so that they could rule over everyone. Divide and conquer, divide and rule. The Assads applied it in Lebanon during the civil war and after. They applied it in Syria. In Egypt, there was a lot of repression. There was a lot of fear that was sowed in the hearts of Coptic Christians, who are now also very concerned about their future. But at the very beginning of 2011, in January of 2011, before the uprising started, there were a couple of attacks against cults in Cairo. And that was under Mubarak's rule. I mean, if he was the almighty ruler, how could that have happened under his watch, is the question that you wonder. A lot of the rise in militancy in Syria, for example, the jihadi groups. I reported on jihadi groups in Syria in the wake of the Iraq war. President Assad was encouraging Arab fighters from around the Arab world to come to Syria and from there give them passage into Iraq to fight the Americans in Iraq. That gave him, you know, political capital with these groups, so they'd stay away from him. They would then, some of the Syrians among them would then return to Syria and be allowed to, you know, kind of, he would let them be in Syria. But he would always point at them to the outside world and say, it's either me or it's them and chaos. But he helped produce them. And that's the, you know, slightly Machiavellian game that these rulers play. And it's a form of blackmail. But it has terrible consequences for the future of these countries, and it means that the path towards freedom, stability, is going to be very hard. But it doesn't mean that we should yearn for the days of dictatorship when everything was stable. I think that in the short term it's going to be very difficult. It may take 5, 10, 20 years, but I do have hope. I do have hope for the region.
In the middle, in the middle.
So as a recent graduate and a student of international affairs, I've been encouraged in my move to DC to hear the themes of nuance, cultural context, and partnership appear more and more consistently in public dialogue. My question for the 2 or 3 of you is, do you have any sense of how we, especially my generation, turn those themes and those buzzwords into a reality, into something that is a part of American foreign policy? What would that look like in practice, or any ways forward?
Please.
I suppose the first thing to say is it's a very good thing that we are using these words more often. And I suppose that the journey towards a more nuanced, fuller, deeper understanding of anywhere is understanding the language that we're using and understanding the power of words. I think that it is important that we keep hold of that language and keep pushing it. The more that you use these words in conversation with the people that you're meeting, even that will encourage others not to essentialize other bits of the world or other groups of people, but to try and think of them as the very complex individuals that we all are. I suppose just that understanding alone can have a profound impact on foreign policy. It can have a very profound impact in the way that people decide to vote, or the way that people decide to act, whether it's locally or globally. I don't think it should be limited to the Middle East. But yeah, I think it's a very good start. As you say, we are using the right language. It's a long road to.
So you're a recent graduate of
A small liberal arts school north of Boston.
but what did you study? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. International affairs, political science.
And why did you decide to study that?
What's that?
Why did you decide to study international affairs?
I've asked myself the same question. I came from a politically conservative family where politics were essentialized or oversimplified. And I think that entering as an undergrad in 2008, my interest in American foreign policy came to the forefront, but also spending time abroad very at a young age or formative age and learning just that about people.
I think that you're off to a great start in terms of helping to spread the word about nuance. I don't know what you want to do as a career, but I think that traveling is very important, because even as a journalist who has traveled a lot around the world, I've been to many countries with Clinton, but also in my own reporting I've been to many countries. I have the ability to understand a place, as much as you can ever understand a place, a little bit quicker than someone who maybe has never traveled or hasn't traveled as much as me. And I often have to report about countries without ever having been there. But I do find that the minute the first time I went to Pakistan, for example, I'd already reported about Pakistan from Washington, but I'd never been there. And the minute I went there, I didn't necessarily understand all the nuances about the country, but you get a better feel for the place. You can see it, hear it, smell it, feel it, and it just adds to your understanding of it. Now, I don't want to get into, superficial reporting, people who think they know a country because they've been to the airport, which is, what some of our colleagues, right? You have to also understand that you'll never really fully understand the country. Sometimes I don't understand my own country, Lebanon, even though I've lived there 30 years. But Lebanon is special in many good ways and slightly, lesser good ways. But I think that also engaging in the conversation, whether you want to start a blog, whether you want to be on Twitter, on Facebook, I do think that even though, as a journalist who works mostly for traditional media, I should frown upon all this social media that's undoing our profession. I actually think there is, it is great that we can engage with people, and I pay a lot of attention to what I get on my Twitter feed, because even if it's 140 characters at a time, I'm going to do my best to explain those nuances to people. And sometimes I do it with 140 characters, and sometimes, I do it with a book. But I wrote the book, I think, for people like you, for your family. And I am delighted to hear that it is being read in small towns across America. And I get handwritten letters from people telling me they've read the book and that they finally understand a little bit more how America is perceived around the world, or what the job of Secretary of State is really like. And so every bit matters. And I think that if you're already aware that nuance is key, then you're already off to a great start. Is there a question right here?
Yeah, just, it's actually a comment. My name is Maureen Terry, I'm first generation Iranian, and we left the country at the time of the revolution, and you mentioned that people are installed in dictatorships, and I think that, you know, and we saw this in Egypt, was very much reminiscent of what we've gone through in Iran at the time of the revolution. I think there's a sense of nostalgia for change at that time where there was a more secular country in place. I think, and that's probably true of sort of a lot of Iranians. They say that, and I believe, by the way, that a lot of it is false, and there is a false sense of security. But I think the notion of moving from secular to religious is one that is concerning for a lot of Iranians. And I think we saw it in Egypt. The most amazing and miraculous thing was what just happened there with the people sort of uprising in the sense of liberation that people had to actually do that when they saw something they didn't like. So there's a contrast between the two, but I think it was really interesting because a lot of Iranians, what had happened in Egypt, the first revolution, people said, oh my God, this is exactly what happened to us. And there was that sense of sort of nostalgia that you mentioned. But do you feel like there's a role for religion in all that? Or do you think that it's just
Well, it's a conservative region, and I think it's important to accept that. I think it's important to accept that, you know, women in the region may never walk around in tank tops and miniskirts, and, you know, men will have beards, and it's just, you know, this is part of our diversity, and it's important to accept it. But just a couple of very quick points. It was secular in appearance, but people didn't turn religious overnight. People were religious and conservative under Mubarak's rule, but Mubarak was clean-shaven, wore a tie, and made it look like everybody, or made it sound like everybody in the country was like him. He presented a sort of palatable face to the outside world of what his country was like, but it was a facade, I think. Second of all, I think that what happened in Egypt, and I'd be very curious to know your thoughts on it, because you lived there. My concern about what happened in Egypt in phase 2 and the second coup, if you will, is that it is going to push the Muslim Brotherhood back underground. And the reason why they are so conservative and militant about their ideology is because they've been underground for so many years. And that's going back to the point you raised. These dictatorships did not allow things to take their course. And my concern is that the Muslim Brotherhood has not actually been allowed to fail, really. They were taken out of power very quickly. And they ruled in a terrible way. They made a lot of mistakes. President Morsi made a lot of mistakes. And perhaps there is an argument to be made that people simply couldn't take the chance to allow him to stay in power any longer, or he would consolidate his power too much and never have another election. You know, perhaps, but clearly people in Egypt, you know, aren't going to take that, and they're going to bring down whoever doesn't listen to them. But the other trend that I find very concerning in Egypt now is that the liberals think that they are right, that they own the truth, and that, you know, the Islamists shouldn't be part of government. But that's, you know, it cannot continue to be winner takes all in the region. Unfortunately, it's just a process that we're going to have to go through. But the liberals are doing the exact same thing that they were accusing the Islamists of doing. And somehow they have to meet in the middle. And I'm not sure how or when they're going to do that.
Yeah, great point to raise, and related very closely to what you said. Who remembers reading 1984 in high school? 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. Beards bad, clean shaven good. It ain't that simple. Mubarak clean shaven, King Mohammed VI, King of Morocco, who is defender of the faith in Morocco, has no beard. Saddam Hussein, famous moustache wearer, Father
Bashar
Christmas.
al-Assad.
Father Christmas has a beard. He's one of the most kind-hearted people we all love to think of. Any image you see of Jesus has a beard. You know, it's just a piece of facial hair. You've got to look beyond the beard. I see no de facto reason why Islam should not have a role in politics. It has a role in politics. It's always had a role in politics in the region, whether it's electoral politics, family politics, domestic politics. There are lots of different types of politics. I fully appreciate the concern of what was happening in Egypt over the past 12 months. But the ouster of Morsi, as Kim said, may just drive Muslim Brotherhood supporters underground again. Morsi won power with 51% of the vote. That doesn't mean that 51% of the population of Egypt were Muslim Brotherhood supporters. They formed an alliance to win that election. And then Morsi didn't take my grandmother's advice. He didn't listen. He had 12 months to make a difference, to bring on some economists, to bring on some secularists, to bring on a variety of Egyptian society. But he wasn't toppled because he was a Muslim. He wasn't toppled because he was the Brotherhood leader. In the same way that Mubarak wasn't toppled because he was a secularist. They were toppled for economic reasons. The week that Morsi was got rid of, fuel prices spiked in Egypt so that there was no petrol for cars. Cars were being abandoned by the side of the road in greater numbers than ever before. It's very easy to look at Islam or the Brotherhood and say, boogeyman, scary. Listen, people are out there because they want jobs, yeah, they want dignity, but they want food first. If you can't drive to work, if there's no job to get to, if you can't put food on the table, you're in big trouble. And last year, I beg your pardon, 2 years ago, 26% of Egyptian GDP went on subsidies for food and fuel. Clearly, that's unsustainable. Equally clearly, you can't get rid of 26% of the GDP, the subsidies, overnight. It's been tried in Algeria, it was tried in Egypt in the 70s. Every time you remove all these subsidies, there will be riots because people will starve. So I really think that it's important to get the economy clear in our heads, because I think it makes it begin more human. It's more the sort of thing that we understand. Money in your pocket, a bad economy. And that's, I think, what gets people out into the streets in greater numbers than religion does.
I think you're opening a window to a whole other conversation that we're going to have to book right away. But if you haven't seen it, The Economist did an excellent, about 16-page review of all that's gone on across the Middle East and focused quite a bit, of course, in depth on the economy and the shortcomings thereof. Last question, then I'm going to wrap up and invite everyone to get a book or more than one book so that Kim can sign it for you. Anne.
Thank you. My name is Ann Townsend, and I'm the founder of two organizations devoted to social diplomacy, the Trust for Museum Exhibitions and Museum Exchange. But my question is not related to that at all. What kind of a threat is the Taliban to a forward movement? Well, the way it's reported in this country, it just seems like it's a many-headed tiger. You get a victory here, 3 more pop up there. But I don't think we can get a clear idea of really what their power is and how much of their staying power is and how much a threat they are to progress.
Don't want to end on an easy question. That wouldn't be the way to start the meeting. Yeah, please.
There are two aspects to their power. One is military and the fight that they're in with the Americans in Afghanistan, and the second is their power in society and how much they can or cannot impose their way of doing things on Afghan society. I'm not a think that, as long as American troops are in Afghanistan, the Taliban will fight them. I think that's just how occupation works. And for the Taliban, the American troops are an occupying force. So you cannot really break that cycle unless there's a withdrawal. And we saw that in Lebanon with the Israeli occupation and Hezbollah, for example. But the two justify each other. The Americans say, well, we can't leave until we're done with the Taliban threat, and the Taliban say, well, we're not going to stop fighting until you leave. So that's why you're seeing efforts at peace talks now, because that's also something that the Obama administration has come to understand and accept, is that there has to be a political solution that President Karzai and the Taliban come to. I don't know when they might start those talks. They were scuppered recently, but I think it's the only way forward, and I think that the US wants those talks so that they can settle a few issues, including prisoners, but so that they can also set those political talks in motion as they work on their drawdown of troops from Afghanistan.
I probably should have said Taliban and Al-Qaeda.
Well, Al-Qaeda is all different. It's different.
I was wondering what kind of threat either organization is to the progress that we are hoping to see.
And I think with regards to Afghanistan and the Taliban, I don't see the Taliban will take control of the country again when the Americans leave, if that's where the question was heading. I don't know that it was, but that's often what I'm asked. Will the Taliban be in power again? I say no. It's tough.
It doesn't mean they have no power, though.
It doesn't mean they have no power, but they will not be in power. They have power to disrupt, they have power to bring down governments, they have power. I think I just finished by saying that there's that line of Winston Churchill's, that it's always better to jaw than it is to war. And I think the bravest political decisions are those made when people decide to sit down and talk. You may not get this from my accent either, but I'm an Irishman. I was born in England because I wanted to be close to my mother. I was told by my father growing up that there would never be peace in Northern Ireland. My family are both sides of my family are from the Republic of Ireland. And what do you know? It may not be perfect, but at some point, all the parties concerned in Northern Ireland had to sit down, and people spoke to other people who they found abhorrent, often with very good reason, because they were murderers, they were killers, they were terrorists, but they sat down and talked. And the violence, let's say it hasn't gone away completely, but it's a damn sight better than it was in the 1970s and 80s. We may hate these people, the Taliban, but we must talk to them.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank
that
you.
keeps taking off and being a source of more and more reflection, and I think better understanding. I can't imagine that it won't soon be required reading in international affairs courses from sea to shining sea, and in other countries as well. Thank you both very much for participating and giving so much time this evening. The books are available. We have plenty of them, so if you get inspired to think that you'll be 6 months ahead to the Christmas rush, or beginning of fall, I think you should be sending them to all of your friends and co-workers. May I also ask for you to join me in thanking Heather Haynes, Emily Jansen, Maria Canellis, Ashley Dolliver, and all of the interns who helped make this evening successful. There's food, there's drink, there's still no raindrops outside, so we were always hoping that you could enjoy evening under the linden trees, and thank you once again for joining us and giving so much time tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Nice to see you.